The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets surrounding the royal palace. Sarah Chen walked briskly along the familiar path she took every day to her job at the nearby art gallery. At 23, she had moved to the capital city just 6 months ago, still adjusting to the bustling life around the palace district. The towering walls of the royal residence always made her feel small but also strangely protected. Sarah clutched her canvas bag tighter as she noticed fewer people on the street than usual. The early morning commuters had already passed, and the tourist crowds wouldn't arrive for another hour. She liked this quiet time, when she could hear her footsteps echo against the ancient stones and imagine the centuries of history that had unfolded in this very spot. Behind the palace gates, Guard Captain Marcus Thompson stood at his post, scanning the perimeter with practiced eyes. At 35, he had served the Royal Guard for 12 years, working his way up from a young recruit to one of the most trusted officers in the unit. His dark uniform was perfectly pressed, every button polished to shine in the morning light. Marcus took pride in his appearance and his duty, knowing that the safety of the royal family and the surrounding area rested in his hands and those of his fellow guards. The Royal Guard followed strict protocols that had been established decades ago. Guards were never to leave their assigned posts without direct orders from a superior officer. They were not to engage with civilians unless there was an immediate threat to royal security. Personal feelings and impulses were to be set aside in favor of duty and discipline. These rules had kept the royal family safe for generations, and Marcus had never questioned them. As Sarah rounded the corner near the palace's east wall, she noticed a man in a dark coat following about 50 feet behind her. At first, she thought nothing of it. Many people walked this route to reach the business district. But when she turned left toward the gallery and saw him turn as well, a small knot of worry formed in her stomach. She quickened her pace slightly, her heels clicking faster against the stone. Marcus observed the morning routine from his elevated position at the main gate. He had memorized the patterns of regular pedestrians over the years. The businessman with the red briefcase always passed at 7:15. The elderly woman with her small dog came by at 7:30, and the young woman with the canvas bag had become part of his mental catalog about 3 weeks ago. She always walked with purpose, never lingering or looking around nervously like tourists did. Today, something felt different. Marcus noticed the man in the dark coat maintaining a consistent distance behind the young woman. The man's behavior triggered Marcus's training instincts. He wasn't walking naturally. His pace adjusted too perfectly to match hers, and his head was always turned in her direction rather than looking ahead at his supposed destination. Sarah's worry grew stronger as she realized the man was definitely following her. She had taken 2 random turns, doubling back on herself, and he had mirrored every movement. Her heart began to race as she considered her options. The art gallery was still 3 blocks away. She could see a few shops that might be opening soon, but their lights were still off. The street felt eerily empty for a weekday morning. The man began to close the distance between them. Sarah could hear his footsteps getting louder, more urgent. She broke into a half-run, her bag bouncing against her hip. The sound of her heels on the stones seemed to echo off every building, announcing her fear to the empty street. Marcus watched the situation unfold with growing concern. His training told him to maintain his post and call for backup if needed. The young woman was not on royal property, and technically whatever was happening to her fell outside his jurisdiction. But something deep in his chest pulled tight as he saw her break into a run. The man behind her was now moving much faster, his intentions becoming clearer with each step. Sarah spotted an alley between 2 old buildings and made a split-second decision to duck into it, hoping to hide until the man passed by. But as she pressed herself against the cold brick wall, she realized she had made a terrible mistake. The alley was a dead end, blocked by a high fence at the far end. She was trapped. The man appeared at the mouth of the alley moments later, his face now visible in the morning light. He was older than she had expected, perhaps in his 40s, with unkempt hair and clothes that suggested he had been sleeping rough. His eyes had a wild look that made Sarah's blood freeze. He smiled as he realized she had nowhere to run. From his post, Marcus lost sight of both figures as they disappeared into the narrow space between buildings. His radio crackled with routine morning reports from other guards, but he barely heard them. Every instinct in his body screamed that something terrible was about to happen. He looked at his post, then at the alley, then back at his post. The weight of 12 years of perfect service pressed down on him like a stone. Sarah pressed herself harder against the wall as the man approached slowly, savoring her fear. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a knife, the blade catching a ray of sunlight that had found its way into the narrow space. His voice was rough and low as he spoke, demanding her bag, her jewelry, anything valuable she might have. But Sarah could see in his eyes that he wanted more than just her possessions. The seconds stretched like hours as Marcus faced the most difficult decision of his military career. Everything he had been taught, every rule he had followed, every principle that had guided his service told him to stay at his post and follow protocol. But the image of the young woman's frightened face as she ran burned in his mind like fire. Some choices, he realized, went deeper than duty to an institution. Some choices came from a duty to humanity itself. Marcus threw down his ceremonial helmet and sprinted toward the alley, his heavy boots pounding against the cobblestones. His radio bounced against his belt, crackling with confused voices from other guards who had seen him abandon his post. In his 12 years of service, he had never broken protocol, never disobeyed a direct order, never put his personal feelings above his duty. But as he ran, he felt more certain about his choice with every step. The sound of Sarah's scream pierced the morning air just as Marcus reached the alley entrance. The man had grabbed her arm and was pressing the knife close to her throat, his other hand trying to pull her bag away from her. Sarah was fighting back with everything she had, kicking and clawing, but the man was much stronger and had the advantage of the weapon. When the attacker saw Marcus's imposing figure blocking the alley entrance, his eyes went wide with surprise and fear. The Royal Guard uniform commanded respect and fear throughout the city. Everyone knew that crossing a member of the Royal Guard meant facing the full weight of the law and possibly much worse. But the man was desperate, and desperate people make dangerous choices. Marcus raised his hand slowly, trying to appear non-threatening while he assessed the situation. His training had covered hostage scenarios, but always in the context of threats to the royal family. The protocols were clear: maintain distance, call for backup, negotiate until specialized units arrived. But those protocols assumed time and resources that didn't exist in this narrow alley with a terrified young woman and an unstable man with a knife. The attacker tightened his grip on Sarah and pressed the knife harder against her neck. A thin line of blood appeared where the blade touched her skin. His voice shook as he shouted at Marcus to stay back, to leave, to pretend he had never seen anything. The man's desperation was evident in every word. He knew he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. Marcus spoke in the calm, authoritative voice he had perfected over years of dealing with difficult situations. He told the man that he didn't want anyone to get hurt, that they could work something out, that there was still time to make this right. But even as he spoke, Marcus was calculating distances, angles, and possibilities. His hand rested casually near his service weapon, though he hoped desperately that he wouldn't need to use it. Sarah's eyes met Marcus's over her attacker's shoulder. In that moment, she saw something that gave her hope. This wasn't just a guard doing his job. This was a man who had chosen to help her, even though he didn't have to. That realization gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She stopped, struggling, and became very still, trying to communicate through her eyes that she trusted whatever Marcus was planning. The attacker seemed to gain confidence from Sarah's stillness, interpreting it as surrender. He began making demands, asking for safe passage out of the area, for guarantees that he wouldn't be followed. Marcus listened carefully, nodding occasionally, but he was really watching for any moment when the man's attention might waver, when his grip on the knife might loosen even slightly. Behind Marcus, other royal guards had discovered his empty post and were beginning to search for him. The sound of running footsteps and shouting voices echoed off the palace walls. The attacker heard them too, and panic began to replace his brief moment of confidence. He knew that once more guards arrived, his chances of escape would disappear completely. Marcus realized that the approaching backup might actually make things worse. A cornered animal fights hardest when it has no escape, and this man was already showing signs of complete desperation. Marcus turned slightly and shouted over his shoulder, ordering the other guards to maintain distance and establish a perimeter. His rank and reputation gave his words weight, even though he was clearly acting outside normal protocols. The attackers, hand was trembling now, causing the knife to shake against Sarah's throat. Small drops of blood stained her white blouse. Marcus could see that the situation was reaching a breaking point. Either the man would realize he was trapped and surrender, or his desperation would drive him to do something irreversible. Marcus had seen enough violence in his career to know the signs. Sarah felt the change in her attacker's grip and posture. His breathing had become rapid and shallow. His whispered words had taken on an edge of finality that terrified her more than anything that had happened so far. She realized that he was preparing to hurt her badly, perhaps fatally, before the other guards arrived. The thought filled her with a cold clarity that surprised her. Marcus saw the same realization dawn in Sarah's eyes. The time for negotiation was over. In a few seconds, this frightened, desperate man was going to do something that would destroy multiple lives forever. Marcus had to act, but any wrong move could result in Sarah's death. The weight of her life and the responsibility he had taken on by abandoning his post settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. The attacker began to pull Sarah deeper, into the alley, toward the dead end where the high fence blocked any escape. Marcus realized that once the man reached that fence, he would feel completely trapped, and trapped animals do terrible things. The distance between them was about 15 feet, too far for Marcus to reach quickly enough to prevent the man from using the knife. But Sarah was not just a victim waiting to be rescued. As the man dragged her backward, she noticed a loose brick protruding from the old wall beside her. The building was ancient, and decades of weather had weakened the mortar holding the stones in place. As her captor focused on Marcus and the sounds of approaching guards, Sarah worked the brick loose with her free hand. Marcus saw what Sarah was doing and felt a surge of admiration for her courage and quick thinking. He began speaking more loudly, drawing the attacker's attention completely to himself, giving Sarah the cover she needed to free the brick completely. He talked about his family, about understanding desperation, about second chances, anything to keep the man's eyes focused forward. When Sarah felt the brick come free in her hand, she didn't hesitate. She twisted in her captor's grip and brought the heavy stone down hard on his wrist, the one holding the knife. The impact sent shockwaves through both their arms, and the knife clattered to the ground between them. The man roared in pain and anger, his injured hand reflexively releasing its grip on Sarah's arm. The moment the knife hit the ground, Marcus launched himself forward with the speed and precision of his military training. Years of physical conditioning and combat practice took over, as he closed the distance between himself and the attacker in 3 powerful strides. The man was still reeling from the brick impact and clutching his injured wrist when Marcus tackled him to the ground, both men crashing hard against the alley's stone surface. Sarah scrambled away from the struggle, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. She pressed herself against the opposite wall, watching as Marcus and her attacker rolled across the narrow space, fighting for control. The sound of their bodies hitting the ground and walls echoed loudly in the confined space, mixing with grunts of effort and pain from both men. The attacker was smaller than Marcus, but fought with the wild desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. He clawed at Marcus's face with his uninjured hand and tried to knee him in the ribs. But Marcus had years of training in close combat situations, and more importantly, he was fighting to protect an innocent person rather than just to save himself. Marcus managed to pin the man's arms and roll him onto his stomach, using a restraint technique he had learned in his early guard training. The attacker continued to struggle, his face pressed against the dirty alley floor, spitting curses and threats. Marcus kept his knee pressed firmly against the man's back while reaching for the plastic restraints all guards carried on their belts. The sound of running boots grew louder as the backup Marcus had called for finally reached the alley entrance. 4 royal guards appeared, their weapons drawn, faces showing confusion and concern at the scene before them. Their captain was on the ground wrestling with a civilian, far from his assigned post, covered in dirt and breathing heavily. It was unlike anything they had ever witnessed in their service. Lieutenant James Harrison, Marcus's second-in-command, lowered his weapon and approached cautiously. He had served under Marcus for 3 years and had never seen his captain act impulsively or emotionally. The sight of the blood on the young woman's throat and the knife lying on the ground helped him understand that something extraordinary had happened here. Marcus secured the restraints around the attacker's wrists and finally stood up, his uniform torn and dirty. He looked at Sarah, who was still pressed against the wall, her hand touching the small cut on her neck. Her eyes were wide with shock, but Marcus could see strength there too. She had not just survived this attack. She had played a crucial role in stopping it. Sarah tried to speak but found her voice caught in her throat. The reality of what had almost happened was beginning to sink in, and her body started to shake uncontrollably. Marcus approached her slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening, speaking in the same calm voice he had used during the crisis. He asked if she was hurt beyond the small cut, if she needed medical attention, if there was anyone he could call for her. The other guards efficiently secured the scene, calling for local police and medical personnel. The attacker was loaded into a police vehicle, still shouting threats and complaints about his injured wrist. Lieutenant Harrison took initial statements from both Marcus and Sarah, though he knew there would be much more paperwork and investigation to follow. As the immediate crisis passed, Marcus began to realize the magnitude of what he had done. He had abandoned his post without orders, engaged in combat with a civilian, and acted completely outside the established protocols that governed his position. The royal family's security had been compromised by his absence, even if only briefly. His career, which had been built on perfect adherence to rules and regulations, was now in serious jeopardy. Sarah finally found her voice and thanked Marcus repeatedly, her words tumbling over each other as she tried to express her gratitude. She told him that she was sure the man would have killed her if Marcus hadn't intervened. The small cut on her neck was nothing compared to what could have happened. She asked for his name, wanting to know who had risked so much to save a complete stranger. Marcus gave her his name but deflected her thanks, saying that any decent person would have done the same thing. But Sarah shook her head firmly. She had lived in the capital long enough to know that most people, even good people, would have called for help and waited for someone else to handle the situation. Marcus had put himself at risk immediately, without hesitation, to protect her. Lieutenant Harrison approached Marcus privately, while the medical technicians checked Sarah's injury. His expression was serious as he informed Marcus that Commander William Sterling, head of the Royal Guard, was on his way to the scene. The commander would want a full explanation of why his most trusted captain had left his post during morning duty hours. Marcus nodded, accepting the news without visible emotion. He had known from the moment he started running toward the alley that there would be consequences. The Royal Guard was not like other military units. They protected the most important family in the nation, and their rules existed for reasons that went beyond normal law enforcement. Even justified actions could result in dismissal if they violated fundamental protocols. Sarah overheard part of the conversation between Marcus and the lieutenant. The realization that Marcus might face punishment for saving her life filled her with a different kind of distress. She approached the two men, her voice stronger now, and declared that she would speak to anyone necessary to explain what had happened. Marcus had prevented a serious crime, possibly saved her life, and deserved recognition, not punishment. Marcus appreciated her offer, but explained gently that military discipline operated differently from civilian law. Good intentions and positive outcomes didn't always protect soldiers from the consequences of breaking rules. Those rules existed to maintain order and ensure that larger responsibilities weren't compromised by individual actions, no matter how well-intentioned. The sound of official vehicles arriving at the alley entrance announced the arrival of Commander Sterling. Marcus straightened his torn uniform as much as possible and prepared to face the man who had been his mentor and commander for over a decade. He had always respected Sterling's dedication to duty and his fair but firm leadership style. Now he would discover whether that respect was mutual. Sarah watched Marcus prepare to face his superior officer and felt a deep sense of injustice. This man had acted heroically, had risked his own future to protect her, and now he might be punished for his courage. She decided that she would not let that happen without a fight, even if it meant taking on the entire Royal Guard system. Commander Sterling appeared at the alley entrance, his gray uniform immaculate despite the early hour. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s who had served the crown for nearly 30 years. His expression was unreadable as he surveyed the scene, taking in the evidence of the struggle, the blood on Sarah's clothes, and the torn condition of Marcus's uniform. Commander Sterling walked slowly through the alley, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the scene. He examined the knife that had been secured as evidence, noted the brick Sarah had used to free herself, and observed the scuff marks on the walls where the struggle had taken place. His face remained expressionless, but those who knew him well could see the careful calculation happening behind his eyes. Marcus stood at attention as his commander approached. Despite his disheveled appearance, years of military discipline made the posture automatic, even though he knew he was about to face the most serious consequences of his career. He met Sterling's gaze directly, ready to accept whatever judgment was coming. Sterling stopped directly in front of Marcus and studied him for a long moment before speaking. When he finally addressed his captain, his voice was measured and professional, showing no hint of his personal feelings about the situation. He asked for a complete report of the events, from the moment Marcus first noticed the suspicious behavior to the arrival of backup units. Marcus delivered his report with military precision, leaving out no details and offering no excuses for his actions. He explained his observation of the pursuit, his decision to abandon his post, and his intervention in the attack. He took full responsibility for breaking protocol and acknowledged that he had put royal security at risk by leaving his assigned position without authorization. Sarah listened to Marcus's clinical recounting of events that had been terrifying and life-changing for her. She was struck by how he described his decision to help her as a simple choice between following rules and preventing harm, with no mention of the courage it had required or the personal cost he now faced. Commander Sterling turned his attention to Sarah, asking her to describe the attack from her perspective. As she spoke, her voice growing stronger with each sentence, Sterling began to understand the full scope of what had occurred. This had not been a simple robbery or random crime. The attacker had stalked Sarah, trapped her, and clearly intended to do serious harm before Marcus's intervention. Lieutenant Harrison provided additional context about the attacker, who had been identified as Thomas Mitchell, a man with a history of violent crimes who had recently been released from prison. Mitchell had been living rough in the area around the palace for several weeks, and local police had received reports of him following women, though no formal complaints had been filed. The medical technician finished treating Sarah's neck wound and reported that while the cut was superficial, it had been made with significant pressure and could easily have been fatal if the knife had moved just slightly. The assessment added weight to Sarah's claim that Marcus had likely saved her life through his quick action. Commander Sterling absorbed all the information without comment, his expression remaining neutral. He instructed Lieutenant Harrison to secure the scene completely and ensure that all evidence was properly documented. He also ordered a full review of the morning's security protocols to determine if Marcus's absence had created any actual vulnerabilities in royal protection. As the immediate investigative requirements were handled, Sterling asked to speak with Marcus privately. The two men walked to the far end of the alley, away from the other personnel and civilians. Sarah watched them go, her anxiety growing as she realized that Marcus's fate was being decided in a conversation she couldn't hear. Sterling's first question surprised Marcus. The commander asked not about protocols or procedures, but about Marcus's family. He knew that Marcus's wife Elena was pregnant with their first child, due in just 3 months. The question seemed irrelevant to the situation, but Marcus answered honestly, confirming that Elena was healthy and that they were both excited about becoming parents. The commander then asked about Marcus's future plans, whether he had considered what he would do after his military service ended. Marcus admitted that he had always assumed he would serve for at least 20 years, possibly longer, and that he had never seriously planned for a civilian career. The Royal Guard had been his entire adult life, his identity and his purpose. Sterling nodded slowly and then delivered the news that Marcus had been expecting, but dreading. There would have to be a formal inquiry into his actions. The Board of Military Conduct would review the case and determine whether his abandonment of post constituted grounds for dismissal from the Royal Guard. Until that hearing concluded, Marcus would be suspended from active duty. Marcus accepted the news with the same stoic professionalism he had shown throughout his career. He asked only when the hearing would take place and whether he would be allowed to present his own defense. Sterling confirmed that the hearing would be scheduled within 2 weeks and that Marcus would have the opportunity to speak on his own behalf. Sarah had been watching the conversation between the two men with growing frustration. When she saw Marcus's shoulders slump slightly after Sterling delivered what was obviously bad news, she couldn't contain herself any longer. She approached the two officers, her voice firm with determination, as she insisted on knowing what was happening to the man who had saved her life. Sterling was initially reluctant to discuss military matters with a civilian, but Sarah's obvious distress and the unusual circumstances of the case convinced him to explain the situation. He told her about the upcoming hearing and the possibility that Marcus could be dismissed from service for his actions. Sarah's reaction was immediate and emotional. She declared that the idea of punishing Marcus for saving her life was completely unjust and that she would do everything in her power to prevent it. She demanded to know how she could testify on his behalf, who she needed to speak with, and what evidence would be most helpful for his defense. Commander Sterling found himself in the unusual position of being lectured by a young civilian about military justice. But as he listened to Sarah's passionate defense of Marcus, he began to see the situation from a different perspective. The rules and protocols that governed the Royal Guard were essential, but they were meant to serve the greater good, not to punish those who acted to protect innocent people. Marcus tried to calm Sarah's outburst, explaining that military discipline required certain consequences for breaking rules, regardless of the outcome. But Sarah refused to accept this logic. She pointed out that laws and regulations were created by human beings and could be changed by human beings when they led to unjust results. Sterling observed the interaction between Marcus and Sarah with interest. He could see that Marcus's decision to help her had not been impulsive or emotional, but had come from a deep sense of moral responsibility that was exactly the quality the Royal Guard tried to instill in its members. The irony that Marcus might be punished for demonstrating the very values the Guard sought to promote was not lost on the commander. As the scene in the alley began to wind down and personnel started to clear out, Sterling made a decision that surprised everyone present. He told Sarah that he would personally ensure she had the opportunity to testify at Marcus's hearing. More importantly, he indicated that he would be recommending that the case be handled as a commendation, review rather than a disciplinary action. The suggestion that Marcus might receive recognition rather than punishment for his actions seemed impossible to everyone who heard it. But Sterling had been thinking about the larger implications of the case. The Royal Guard's mission was to protect and serve, and Marcus had done exactly that, even at personal cost to himself. 2 weeks later, the Royal Guard headquarters buzzed with unusual activity as personnel prepared for Marcus's hearing. The case had become the subject of intense discussion throughout the military community, with opinions sharply divided between those who believed rules must be followed absolutely and others who felt that Marcus's actions exemplified the best values of military service. Sarah had spent the intervening weeks gathering support for Marcus's case. She had written letters to local newspapers, contacted civil rights organizations, and even reached out to members of Parliament who served on military oversight committees. Her efforts had generated significant public attention, with many citizens expressing support for the Guard who had risked his career to protect a stranger. Elena Thompson, Marcus's wife, had initially been upset when she learned about the incident and its potential consequences. As a military spouse, she understood the importance of following orders and maintaining discipline. But as she thought about the situation more deeply, she realized that she was proud of her husband for choosing to help someone in danger, even knowing the cost. The hearing was scheduled to take place in the formal conference room at Royal Guard headquarters, a solemn space lined with portraits of distinguished officers from throughout the organization's history. A panel of 5 senior officers would review the case, with Commander Sterling serving as the presiding officer, despite his personal involvement in the investigation. Marcus arrived at headquarters an hour early, wearing his dress uniform and carrying a folder containing character references from fellow guards and commendations he had received throughout his career. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but he still felt nervous about defending actions that went against everything he had been trained to do. Sarah arrived shortly after Marcus, dressed professionally and carrying her own folder of documents. She had researched military law extensively and had prepared a detailed statement about the attack and Marcus's intervention. She was determined to make the panel understand that Marcus had prevented not just a robbery, but a potentially fatal assault. The hearing began with Commander Sterling reading the formal charges against Marcus: abandonment of post, failure to follow established protocols, and engaging in unauthorized combat with a civilian. The language was clinical and official, making Marcus's heroic actions sound like serious crimes against military order. Lieutenant Harrison was called as the first witness, providing a detailed account of the morning's events from the perspective of someone who had arrived after the critical moments, but had seen the immediate aftermath. His testimony confirmed the basic facts of the case but didn't address the more complex questions about whether Marcus's actions were justified. The police officer, who had taken Thomas Mitchell into custody, testified about the attacker's background and mental state. Mitchell had a history of increasingly violent crimes against women, and psychological evaluations suggested that he was likely to have seriously injured or killed Sarah if the attack had continued. This testimony provided crucial context about the severity of the threat Marcus had responded to. When Sarah was called to testify, she spoke with a clarity and passion that impressed everyone in the room. She described the terror of being stalked and trapped, the moment when she realized her attacker intended to do more than just rob her, and the relief she felt when Marcus appeared in the alley entrance. Her voice broke slightly as she explained that she was certain she would have died if Marcus hadn't acted. The panel asked Sarah several difficult questions about whether she believed Marcus could have handled the situation differently, perhaps by calling for backup before intervening directly. Sarah acknowledged that there might have been other approaches, but pointed out that time was a critical factor. Any delay would have given her attacker the opportunity to use his knife with fatal results. Dr. Margaret Foster, a trauma counselor who had worked with Sarah following the attack, testified about the psychological impact of violent crimes and the importance of immediate intervention in preventing lasting harm. She explained that Marcus's quick action had not only saved Sarah's physical life but had also prevented the kind of psychological trauma that often accompanies prolonged victimization. When Marcus was finally called to testify on his own behalf, he spoke simply and directly about his decision-making process. He explained that he had recognized a threat to an innocent person and had chosen to respond based on his oath to protect and serve. He acknowledged that he had broken protocol but maintained that he would make the same choice again under similar circumstances. The panel's questions for Marcus focused heavily on the precedent his actions might set. If guards were allowed to abandon their posts whenever they saw someone in trouble, could royal security be maintained? Marcus responded that he understood the concern, but believed that each situation required individual judgment based on the severity of the threat and the likelihood of preventing serious harm. Commander Sterling then presented his own recommendation to the panel, which surprised many observers. Instead of supporting disciplinary action, Sterling argued that Marcus had demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage and commitment to protecting others that the Royal Guard sought to instill in all its members. He recommended that Marcus be commended rather than punished. The panel deliberated for nearly 3 hours while Marcus, Sarah, and other interested parties waited in the hallway outside the conference room. The time passed slowly with nervous conversation punctuated by long periods of tense silence. Sarah found herself pacing back and forth, unable to sit still while Marcus's future hung in the balance. Elena arrived during the deliberation period, having arranged for childcare so she could be present for the verdict. She sat beside her husband, holding his hand and whispering words of encouragement. Regardless of the panel's decision, she told him, she was proud of the man he was and the choice he had made. Several of Marcus's fellow guards had also gathered to await the verdict, their presence demonstrating the respect and support he enjoyed among his peers. Many of them privately admitted that they hoped they would have the courage to make the same choice Marcus had made, even knowing the potential consequences. When the panel finally emerged from their deliberation, their expressions gave no hint of their decision. Commander Sterling called all parties back into the conference room and asked everyone to stand while the verdict was read. The formal language and solemn atmosphere made the moment feel like a military court-martial rather than an administrative hearing. The panel's decision was complex and unprecedented. They found that Marcus had indeed violated established protocols by abandoning his post without authorization. However, they also concluded that his actions had been motivated by the highest principles of military service and had resulted in the prevention of a serious crime. Rather than dismissal or disciplinary action, the panel recommended that Marcus receive a formal commendation for valor, while also implementing new training protocols to help guards handle similar situations in the future. The decision acknowledged both the importance of following rules and the need for individual judgment in extraordinary circumstances. The announcement of the panel's decision sent ripples of surprise throughout the room. Marcus felt a wave of relief so powerful that his knees nearly buckled. For weeks he had prepared himself for the end of his military career, for the need to find a new purpose and identity outside the Royal Guard. The possibility of commendation rather than punishment had seemed too good to hope for. Sarah burst into tears of joy and relief, her emotional response contrasting sharply with the formal atmosphere of the military hearing. She had invested so much energy and emotion in fighting for Marcus's vindication that the positive outcome felt almost overwhelming. The knowledge that justice had been served, that courage had been recognized rather than punished, restored her faith in institutions she had begun to doubt. Elena squeezed her husband's hand tightly, her own eyes filling with tears as she realized that their family's future was secure. The pregnancy had made the stakes of the hearing feel even higher, as they faced the possibility of losing not just Marcus's career, but also their primary source of income just months before their first child's arrival. Commander. Sterling felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he watched the reactions around the room. The decision had not been easy, and he knew it would face criticism from those who believed military discipline required absolute adherence to rules regardless of circumstances. But he was convinced that the panel had reached the right conclusion, one that honored both the importance of protocol and the fundamental mission of the Royal Guard. The formal commendation ceremony was scheduled for the following month, giving the Royal Guard time to prepare an appropriate recognition of Marcus's actions. The ceremony would be attended by high-ranking military officials and would serve as a public statement about the values the organization sought to promote among its members. In the weeks following the hearing, Marcus returned to duty with a new perspective on his role and responsibilities. The experience had taught him that blind obedience to rules was not always the same as faithful service to the mission those rules were meant to support. He began mentoring younger guards about the importance of situational awareness and moral courage. Sarah threw herself into advocacy work, using her experience to help other crime victims navigate the complex systems of law enforcement and military justice. She had learned that individual voices could make a difference when raised in support of justice, and she wanted to help others who might find themselves in similar situations. The story of Marcus's heroic intervention and subsequent vindication spread far beyond the military community. Local newspapers picked up the story, and it soon became a symbol of the ongoing debate about when individuals should follow rules and when they should follow their conscience. Editorial writers and social commentators used the case to discuss larger questions about institutional authority and personal responsibility. Thomas Mitchell, Sarah's attacker, was convicted of assault with a deadly weapon and attempted robbery. The severity of his sentence was influenced by his prior criminal record and by testimony about the violence he would likely have committed if not for Marcus's intervention. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, with mandatory psychological counseling as part of his rehabilitation program. The Royal Guard implemented new training protocols based on lessons learned from Marcus's case. Guards were given additional instruction in recognizing and responding to threats against civilians in the area around the palace. While the protocols still emphasized the importance of maintaining assigned posts, they also provided clearer guidance about when and how guards could respond to emergencies outside their direct jurisdiction. Marcus found that his relationship with his fellow guards had evolved in unexpected ways. Some colleagues viewed him as a hero who had shown them what true courage looked like. Others remained uncomfortable with his decision to break protocol, feeling that it set a dangerous precedent that could undermine military discipline. These mixed reactions taught Marcus that doing the right thing didn't always lead to universal approval. Sarah and Marcus developed an unlikely friendship based on their shared experience of that terrifying morning in the alley. They met occasionally for coffee, discussing how the incident had changed both their lives and their perspectives on courage, duty, and moral responsibility. Sarah often told Marcus that he had given her more than just physical safety. He had restored her faith in human goodness. Elena gave birth to a healthy daughter 3 months after the hearing, and Marcus found that fatherhood gave him new insights into the protective instincts that had driven his actions that morning. Holding his newborn child, He understood even more deeply why he had been unable to stand by and watch while someone else's daughter was in danger. The formal commendation ceremony took place on a crisp autumn morning at the Royal Guard headquarters. Marcus stood at attention in his dress uniform, while Commander Sterling read the citation, recognizing his valor and commitment to protecting innocent life. The language of the commendation carefully balanced recognition of his courage with acknowledgement of the importance of military discipline. Sarah attended the ceremony as an honored guest, wearing a blue dress that covered the small scar on her neck that served as a permanent reminder of that frightening morning. She felt immense pride watching Marcus receive the recognition he deserved, knowing that his courage had not only saved her life, but had also sparked important conversations about the nature of duty and service. The ceremony concluded with Marcus receiving the Medal of Valor, one of the highest honors the Royal Guard could bestow on its members. As the medal was pinned to his uniform, Marcus thought about the chain of decisions that had led to this moment. His choice to abandon his post, Sarah's quick thinking with the brick, Commander Sterling's decision to recommend commendation rather than punishment. Following the ceremony, Marcus was promoted to senior captain, a recognition that his judgment and leadership abilities had been enhanced rather than compromised by his willingness to act outside normal protocols. The promotion came with additional responsibilities for training new guards and developing policies that balanced security requirements with humanitarian concerns. Years later, Marcus would tell new recruits about that morning in the alley, using it as a teaching tool to help them understand that true military virtue sometimes required the courage to make difficult decisions in ambiguous situations. He emphasized that following orders was essential, but that the ultimate goal of those orders was to protect and serve the greater good. Sarah eventually moved away from the capital city to pursue graduate studies in social work, but she maintained contact with Marcus and his growing family. She often spoke at conferences and workshops about victim advocacy, using her story to illustrate how individual acts of courage could create ripple effects that benefited entire communities. The alley where the attack took place became an unlikely landmark in the neighborhood around the Royal Palace. Local residents would sometimes point it out to visitors, telling the story of the guard who broke protocol to save a stranger's life. The tale became part of the area's folklore, a reminder that heroism could emerge from the most ordinary circumstances when good people chose to act on their convictions. 5 years after that life-changing morning in the alley, Marcus stood before a new class of Royal Guard recruits, his senior captain's insignia gleaming on his uniform. The young men and women before him listened intently as he shared the story that had become legendary within the organization. He no longer told it as a personal experience, but as a lesson about the complex relationship between duty, courage, and moral judgment. Sarah had completed her master's degree in social work and returned to the capital city to establish a victim advocacy center. The center provided support and guidance to people who had experienced violent crimes, helping them navigate the legal system and access counseling services. The small scar on her neck had faded to a thin white line, barely visible unless someone looked closely. But the impact of that morning continued to shape every aspect of her professional life. Marcus's daughter Emma was now a precocious 5-year-old who loved to hear stories about her father's work. Though he carefully edited the more frightening details for her young ears, she knew that her daddy was a hero who helped people, and she often announced to strangers that she planned to be a guard just like him when she grew up. Marcus hoped that by the time she was old enough to make that choice, the world would be safer for everyone. The Royal Guard had become something of a model for other security organizations, with military units from around the world studying the training protocols that had emerged from Marcus's case. The balance between rigid discipline and situational judgment that the organization had achieved was considered innovative and effective, leading to invitations for Marcus and Commander Sterling to speak at international conferences. Thomas Mitchell had been released from prison after serving 6 years of his sentence, with time off for good behavior and successful completion of psychological treatment programs. He had struggled to readjust to life outside prison, but with the help of social workers and counselors, he had found stable housing and employment. He had written a letter of apology to Sarah through the Victim Services Office, though she had chosen not to respond directly. Commander Sterling had retired from active duty, but remained involved with the Royal Guard as a consultant and trainer. His decision to support Marcus during the hearing had become a defining moment of his own career, demonstrating the kind of leadership that prioritized justice and common sense over rigid adherence to bureaucratic rules. He often said that Marcus's case had reminded him why he had joined the military in the first place. The friendship between Marcus and Sarah had evolved into something deeper than shared trauma. Their families had become close, with Sarah serving as Emma's godmother and Marcus providing support during Sarah's most challenging moments in graduate school. They had discovered that the bond forged in crisis could grow into something lasting and meaningful when nurtured with care and mutual respect. Elena had returned to her career as a nurse after Emma started school, finding renewed purpose in caring for others after seeing how much her husband's active service had meant to their family and community. She often told friends that the hearing had been terrifying at the time, but that she now understood it had led to the best possible outcome for everyone involved. The art gallery where Sarah had been walking that morning had commissioned a small memorial plaque for their building, recognizing the events that had taken place nearby, and honoring both the courage of those who acted and the resilience of those who survived. The plaque had become a stopping point for tourists interested in the area's history. Though most visitors had no idea how close they were to the exact spot where the attack had occurred, Marcus had been asked several times to write a book about his experience, but he had always declined, feeling that the story belonged as much to Sarah as to him. He preferred to share the lessons he had learned through his training work and mentoring relationships, finding more satisfaction in helping others develop their own judgment and courage than in reliving his own moment of decision. The Royal Guards Training Academy had established the Marcus Thompson Award for Moral Courage, given annually to a guard who demonstrated exceptional judgment in balancing duty with humanitarian concerns. Marcus had initially resisted having the award named after him, but Commander Sterling had convinced him that his example could inspire future generations of guards to think carefully about the deeper purposes behind their service. Sarah's Victim Advocacy Center had grown from a small office with 2 staff members to a significant organization serving hundreds of people each year. She had testified before Parliament about the need for better support services for crime victims and had helped draft legislation that improved coordination between law enforcement, medical services, and social support systems. On quiet mornings when Marcus walked past the alley where everything had changed, he sometimes paused to remember that moment when he had to choose between following rules and following his conscience. The decision still felt right to him, perhaps even more so now that he understood its long-term consequences. He had learned that true leadership sometimes required the courage to stand alone, to act on principles even when the outcome was uncertain. Emma Thompson would grow up hearing the story of her father's courage, though she would also learn about the courage shown by Sarah, by Commander Sterling, and by everyone who had chosen to do the right thing even when it was difficult. The legacy of that morning in the alley was not just one person's heroism, but a community's commitment to protecting the vulnerable and supporting those who stood up for others. Years later, when historians wrote about changes in military culture and the evolution of security protocols in the early 21st century, Marcus's case would be cited as a turning point that helped organizations balance traditional discipline with modern understanding of moral responsibility. But for those who lived through it, the story would always be simpler and more personal. It was about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when it mattered most. The alley itself had been renovated as part of a neighborhood improvement project, with better lighting and security cameras installed to prevent future crimes, but residents still called it Heroes Alley, a nickname that had emerged organically and stuck despite the city's attempt to give it a more formal designation. Sometimes the simplest names capture the most important truths about the places where our lives are changed forever.